The Byzantine Civil War of 1341–47, sometimes referred to as the Second Palaiologan Civil War, was a conflict that broke out after the death of Andronikos III Palaiologos over the guardianship of his 9-year-old son and heir, John V Palaiologos. It pitted on the one hand Andronikos III's chief minister, John VI Kantakouzenos, and on the other the Empress-Dowager Anna of Savoy, the Patriarch of Constantinople John XIV Kalekas, and the megas-doux Alexios Apokaukos. The war polarized Byzantine society along class lines, with the aristocracy backing Kantakouzenos and the lower and middle class supporting the regency. To a lesser extent, the conflict acquired religious overtones. Byzantium was embroiled in the hesychasm controversy, and adherence to the mystical doctrine of hesychasm was often equated with support for Kantakouzenos, as the chief aide and closest friend of Emperor Andronikos III. Kantakouzenos became regent for the underage John V upon the emperor's death in June 1341. While Kantakouzenos was absent from Constantinople in September the same year, a coup d'etat led by Alexios Apokaukos and the Patriarch John XIV secured the support of Empress Anna and established a new regency. In response, Kantakouzenos' army and supporters proclaimed him co-emperor in October, cementing the rift between himself and the new regency. The split immediately escalated into armed conflict. During the first years of the war, forces of the new regency prevailed, in the wake of several anti-aristocratic uprisings, most notably that of the Zealots in Thessalonica. A majority of the cities in Thrace and Macedonia came under regency control, with assistance from Stefan Dusan of Serbia and Umar Beg of Aydin. Kantakouzenos successfully reversed these gains. By 1345, despite Dusan's defection to the opposition and the withdrawal of Umar, Kantakouzenos retained the upper hand through the assistance of Orhan, ruler of the Ottoman Emirate. The June 1345 murder of megas-doux Apokaukos, the regency's chief administrator, dealt the regency a severe blow. Formally crowned as emperor in Adrianople in 1346, Kantakouzenos entered Constantinople on 3 February 1347. By agreement, he was to rule for 10 years as the senior emperor and regent for John V, until the boy came of age and ruled alongside him. Despite this apparent victory, subsequent resumption of the civil war forced John VI Kantakouzenos to abdicate and retire to become a monk in 1354. The consequences of the prolonged conflict proved disastrous for the empire, which had regained a measure of stability under Andronikos III. 7 years of warfare, the presence of marauding armies, social turmoil, and the advent of the Black Death devastated Byzantium and reduced it to a rump state. The conflict also allowed Dusan to conquer Albania, Epirus and most of Macedonia, where he established the Serbian Empire. The Bulgarian Empire also acquired territory north of the Evros River. Background: in 1341, the once mighty Byzantine Empire was in a state of turmoil. Despite the restoration of the empire's capital to Constantinople and the recovery of a measure of its former power by Michael VIII Palaiologos, the policies implemented during his reign had exhausted the state's resources, and the empire's strength waned under his successor, Andronikos II Palaiologos. During Andronikos II's long reign, the remaining Byzantine possessions in Asia Minor slowly fell to the advancing Turks, most notably the newly established Ottoman Emirate. This caused a flood of refugees into Byzantium's European provinces, while at the same time the Catalan Company wrought havoc in the imperial domains. Taxes also rose dramatically to finance tributes to the empire's enemies. A combination of these failures and personal ambition moved the emperor's grandson and heir, the young Andronikos III Palaiologos, to revolt. Supported by a group of young aristocrats led by John Kantakouzenos and Syrianus Palaiologos, Andronikos III deposed his grandfather after a series of conflicts during the 1320s. Although successful in removing the old emperor from power, the war did not augur well for the future, as the empire's neighbors, the Serbs, Bulgarians, Turks, Genoese and Venetians, took advantage of Byzantine infighting to gain territory or expand their influence within the empire. The only son of a former governor of the Byzantine holdings in the Morea, John Kantakouzenos, was related to the Palaiologoi through his mother. He inherited vast estates in Macedonia, Thrace and Thessaly, and became a childhood friend and the closest and most trusted advisor of Andronikos III. During Andronikos III's reign, John Kantakouzenos acted as his chief minister, holding the office of Megas Domestikos, commander-in-chief of the Byzantine army. The relationship between the two remained close, and in 1330, when the heirless Andronikos III fell ill, he insisted that Kantakouzenos be proclaimed emperor-regent after his death. Their ties were further strengthened in the spring of 1341, when the latter's eldest son, Matthew Kantakouzenos, wed Irene Palaiologos Anna, a cousin of the emperor. Unlike Andronikos II, who had disbanded the Byzantine army and navy, and who favored monks and intellectuals, Andronikos III was an energetic ruler who personally led his forces in military campaigns. In 1329, his first campaign against the Ottomans resulted in a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Peleikanos, after which the Byzantine position in Bithynia rapidly collapsed. Subsequent sorties into the Balkans were nevertheless successful in shoring up Andronikos' tottering realm. Thessaly and the Despotate of Epirus, two territories separated from the empire after the Fourth Crusade, were restored to imperial rule, almost without bloodshed, in 1328 and 1337 respectively. Andronikos III also rebuilt a modest fleet, which allowed him to recover the rich and strategically placed island of Chios from the Genoese-Sacaria family in 1329, as well as to claim the allegiance of Andreilo-Catania, the Genoese governor of Phasia on the Anatolian mainland. In 1335, however, Andreilo's son Domenico captured the island of Lesbos with Genoese assistance. The emperor led a fleet to recover it in Phasia, and requested the aid of the Turkish emirs of Saruhan and Aydin. Saruhan sent troops and supplies, but Aydin's ruler Umar Beg came to meet the emperor in person. It was during this encounter that Kantakouzenos and Umar established a long-lasting close friendship and alliance. A war with Serbia in 1331 to 1334 proved less successful for the emperor when several towns in Macedonia were captured by the Serbs, led by the renegade Syrianus Palaiologos. These gains were only curtailed when the assassination of Syrianus and the threat of a Hungarian invasion forced the Serbian ruler, Stefan Dusan, to seek a negotiated settlement. The subsequent peace treaty concluded between Andronikos III and Dusan was important for the future of Byzantine-Serbian relations. For the first time, the Byzantines recognized the extensive gains the Serbs had made at the empire's expense in the Central Balkans during Andronikos II's reign. In the aftermath of the pact, Dusan also moved his seat, and with it his realm's center of gravity, south to Prilep. Although the loss of Asia Minor proved irreversible, successes in Epirus and Thessaly led to a consolidation of the empire in the Greek-speaking lands of the southern Balkans. Andronikos III and Kantakouzenos planned further campaigns to recover the Latin principalities of southern Greece, a project of major long-term importance, for, as the historian Donald Nicol writes, if the whole peninsula of Greece could be united under Byzantine government, then the empire would once again be a homogeneous structure, able to stand up to the Serbians, the Italians and its other enemies. It would be small, but it would be a compact and manageable economic and administrative unit running from Cape Matapan to Thessalonica and Constantinople. Kantakouzenos regency, June to September 1341. Following a short illness, on the night of 14-15 June 1341 the Emperor Andronikos III died at the relatively early age of 45, possibly due to chronic malaria. His 9-year-old son John was the obvious successor, but he had not been officially proclaimed or crowned as co-emperor. This left a legal vacuum, and raised the question of who would lead the empire's government. According to Byzantine custom, the Empress-Dowager automatically headed any regency. Nevertheless, despite the lack of any formal appointment, Kantakouzenos placed Andronikos III's sons and the Empress-Dowager Anna of Savoy under armed guard in the palace, and in a meeting of the Byzantine Senate claimed for himself the regency and governance of the state by virtue of his close association with the deceased emperor. He also demanded that John V marry forthwith his own daughter Helena Kantakouzenos. This claim was disputed by Patriarch John XIV Kalekas, who presented a document from Andronikos dating from 1334, assigning to him the care of the imperial family in the case of his death. Only after a demonstration of the capital's troops on the 20th of June did Kantakouzenos secure recognition as regent and control of the reins of government, as well as maintaining control over the army as its megas domestikos. Nevertheless, opposition to Kantakouzenos began to coalesce around three figures: the Patriarch, a forceful man determined to have a voice in the governance of the empire; the Empress-Regent, who feared that Kantakouzenos would dispossess her son; and last but not least Alexios Apokaukos, the ambitious megas-do and head of the bureaucracy. A new man, promoted to high office as the protege of Andronikos III and possibly the richest man in the empire by 1341. Apokaukos was distrusted by the hereditary aristocracy. The only surviving narrative accounts of the period, Kantakouzenos's memoirs and the history of Nicephorus Gregoras, with the pro-aristocracy bias, paint a very negative picture of the man. According to Kantakouzenos, Apokaukos' adherence to the Patriarch's camp resulted from his ambition. Apokaukos sought further advancement by trying to convince Kantakouzenos to declare himself emperor. When the latter refused, Apokaukos secretly switched his allegiance. In Donald Nicol's opinion, had Kantakouzenos remained at Constantinople, his authority might have remained secure. As the megas domestikos and regent, however, he had the duty of dealing with the empire's various enemies, who sought to take advantage of Andronikos' death. Dusan had invaded Macedonia, the emir of Saruhan raided the coasts of Thrace, and Tsar Ivan Alexander of Bulgaria threatened war. In July, Kantakouzenos left the capital at the head of the army, leaving control of the government to Apokaukos, whom he still believed loyal to him. Kantakouzenos' campaign proved successful. He persuaded Dushan to withdraw and repulse the Turkish raiders, while Ivan Alexander, threatened by a fleet from the Emirate of Aydin, renewed his peace treaty with Byzantium. To crown this success, Kantakouzenos received an embassy of the Latin barons of the Principality of Achaia in the Morea. They expressed readiness to surrender the country in exchange for a guarantee of the property and rights. It was a unique opportunity, as Kantakouzenos himself recognized in his memoirs, since if successful, the Catalan-controlled Duchy of Athens was bound to follow, consolidating Byzantine control over Greece. At this point, Kantakouzenos received grave news from Constantinople. In late August, Apokaukos attempted a coup and tried to kidnap John V. Having failed, he fled to his fortified house at Epibati, where he was blockaded by troops. Kantakouzenos returned to Constantinople in early September, where he stayed for a few weeks consulting with the empress. On his way back to Thrace to prepare for a campaign into the Morea, he went to Epibati, where he pardoned Apokaukos and restored him to his former officers. Outbreak of the war, autumn 1341. Kantakouzenos' second departure proved a great error. Back in the capital, his enemies moved in his absence. Apokaukos gathered a group of high-ranking aristocrats around him, including men such as the Megastrongarios John Gabalazar George Chamnos, whom he tied to himself by marriage alliances. The Patriarch, backed by Apokaukos' group and the authority of the Empress, dismissed Kantakouzenos from his offices and declared him a public enemy. Kalekas himself was proclaimed regent and Apokaukos named Epig of Constantinople. Kantakouzenos' relatives and supporters were imprisoned or forced to flee the city, and the properties confiscated. Although Kantakouzenos' wife and children were safe in his headquarters at Demotica, the regency placed his mother, Theodora, under house arrest. The privations she suffered during her imprisonment were to cause her eventual death. As the first groups of his partisans fleeing the capital arrived at Demotica, Kantakouzenos, by his own account, tried to negotiate with the new regency, but his approach was rebuffed. Finally forced to take decisive action on the 26th of October 1341, the army and his supporters, largely drawn from the land-holding aristocracy, proclaimed Kantakouzenos emperor. Although he still presented himself officially as a junior colleague to John V, and claimed to be only acting in the boy's name, having staked his claim on the throne, he had effectively started a civil war. Kantakouzenos still hoped that negotiation might resolve the situation, but all his envoys were imprisoned and he and his supporters excommunicated by Patriarch John XIV. On the 19th of November 1341, the regency responded to Kantakouzenos' proclamation as emperor with the formal coronation of John V. Reaction to Kantakouzenos' proclamation caused a rift in Byzantine society, with the rich and powerful landholding magnates who dominated the countryside quickly rallying to support him, while the ordinary population, often living in abject conditions and suffering under oppressive taxation, supported the Empress-Dowager and the Patriarch. Apokaukos was especially quick to capitalize upon this division and foment popular dislike for the aristocracy, by widely publicizing the immense wealth confiscated from Kantakouzenos and his supporters' houses and estates. In the words of Donald Nicol, it was against him and everything that he stood for as a millionaire and land-owning aristocrat that the people rose up. Kantakouzenos became the war cry, the slogan of the discontent. Thus the battle lines of the civil war were drawn up between urban and rural factions. The cities, dominated by the middle-class civil bureaucracy and merchant class, favored a more mercantile economy and close relations with the Italian maritime republics, while the countryside remained under the control of the conservative landed aristocracy, which derived its wealth from its estates and traditionally shunned commercial and entrepreneurial activities as unworthy of its status. The lower social strata tended to support the respective dominant faction, the middle classes in the cities and the landholding magnates in the countryside. Polarization of this nature was not new in the Byzantine Empire. Evidence of competition between the landed aristocracy and the city-based middle classes in the political, economic and social spheres has been attested since the 11th century, but the scale of the conflict that erupted in 1341 was unprecedented. This class conflict was mirrored in the breakaway Byzantine Empire of Trebizond as well, where a pro-imperial and pro-Constantinopolitan urban faction confronted the provincial landholding aristocracy between 1340 and 1349. The more conservative and anti-Western tendencies of the aristocrats, and the links to the staunchly Orthodox and anti-Catholic monasteries, also explained their increased attachment to the mystical hesychasm movement advocated by Gregory Palamas, whose views were mostly opposed in the cities, although several significant exceptions leave the issue open to question among modern scholars. In the contemporary popular mind, the supporters of Palamasm and of Kantakouzenos were usually equated. Kantakouzenos' eventual victory also meant the victory of hesychasm, confirmed in a synod in Constantinople in 1351. Hesychasm eventually became a hallmark of the Orthodox Church tradition, although it was rejected by the Catholics as a heresy. The first manifestation of this social division appeared in Adrianople, where, on the 27th of October, the populace expelled the city's aristocrats, securing it for the regency. This event was repeated over the next weeks in town after town throughout Thrace and Macedonia, as the people declared their support for the regency and against the despised forces of Kantakouzenos. In this hostile atmosphere, many of Kantakouzenos' soldiers abandoned him and returned to Constantinople. In Demotica alone the popular uprising was quelled, and the town remained Kantakouzenos' main stronghold in Thrace throughout the war. Kantakouzenos seeks Juson's aid. 1342. When heavy snowfall rendered campaigning impossible during the following winter, Kantakouzenos instead sent envoys, including an embassy of monks from Mount Athos to Constantinople. However, they too were dismissed by the Patriarch. By then, almost all of the Byzantine provinces and the governors had declared themselves for the regency. Only Theodore Synodanos, an old associate of Kantakouzenos, who was the governor of the empire's second city, Thessalonica, indicated his support. Synodanos had kept his allegiance to Kantakouzenos secret from the city's populace, and intended to surrender Thessalonica in collusion with the local aristocracy. Furthermore, Relja, the Serbian magnate and virtually independent ruler of Strumica and the Strymon River Valley, seemed to lean towards Kantakouzenos. Consequently, as soon as the weather improved, on the 2nd of March 1342, Kantakouzenos left his wife Irina Sanina, his brother-in-law Manuel Asen and his daughters to hold Demotica and marched west with his army toward Thessalonica. On the way, he first attacked Perithiarion but was repelled and continued westward. Kantakouzenos was however able to take Fortress Melnik, where he met with Relja to forge an alliance. The two armies marched toward Thessalonica, but arrived too late to take control. As they approached the city, Initially, they were met by Synodonos and other aristocrats, who had fled after an uprising led by a radical popular party, the Zealots. Soon afterwards, a fleet of 70 ships led by Apokaukos reinforced the city. Synodonos, whose family had remained behind in Thessalonica, defected to the regency. Apokaukos' son John was appointed governor of Thessalonica, although effective power rested with the Zealots, who for the next 7 years led an autonomous regime unparalleled in Byzantine history. At the same time, the regency's army campaigned in Thrace, formally taking possession of towns secured by popular revolt. With Thessalonica barred against him, his supply lines to Thrace cut, and desertions having reduced his army to 2,000 men, of whom half belonged to Relja, Kantakouzenos was forced to withdraw north to Serbia, where he hoped to secure the aid of Stefan Dusan. Soon after, Relja also deserted Kantakouzenos and joined the regency, hoping to gain control of Melnik for himself. In July 1342, Kantakouzenos met Dusan near Pristina. The Serbian ruler appeared initially reluctant to form an alliance. Nevertheless, under pressure from his nobles, especially the powerful Jovan Oliver, he could not afford to miss this unique opportunity to expand south. Desperately in need of Serbian aid, Kantakouzenos apparently agreed that the Serbs could keep any town they took, despite his own later account to the contrary. According to Nicephorus Gregoras, the Serbs claimed all of Macedonia west of Christopolis, except for Thessalonica and its environs. The only concession Kantakouzenos secured was that an exception be made for those towns that surrendered to him in person. To seal the pact, Kantakouzenos' younger son, Manuel, was to be wed to the daughter of Jovan Oliver, although after Dusan later broke the alliance, the marriage did not take place. Relja acceded to the pact, in exchange for the surrender of Melnik by Kantakouzenos' garrison. After Relja's death later that year, Melnik was seized by Dusan. In late summer 1342, Kantakouzenos, accompanied by several Serbian magnates, marched into Macedonia at the head of a Greek and Serbian force, intending to break through to his wife, who still held out at Demotica. His advance was stopped almost immediately before Ceres when the city refused to surrender, and the subsequent siege had to be abandoned after an epidemic killed most of his men, forcing him to retreat into Serbia with a rump force of barely 500 soldiers. Dusan led a more successful parallel campaign, capturing Vodina. Serbian forces captured Florina and Kastoria shortly afterwards, thereby extending the hold over western Macedonia. The Serbs also expanded the control over Albania, so that by the summer of 1343, with the exception of Angevin-controlled Dyrrhachium, all of the region appears to have fallen under Serbian rule. Morale among Kantakouzenos' followers fell dramatically. Rumors circulated in Constantinople that a dejected Kantakouzenos planned to retire to Mount Athos as a monk, and riots broke out in the city in which several rich men were killed and the houses looted by the populace. In late fall, Empress Anna twice sent embassies to Dusan, trying to convince him to surrender Kantakouzenos, but the Serbian ruler, seeking to extract more profit from their alliance, refused. Kantakouzenos' fortunes began to improve when a delegation of the nobles of Thessaly reached him and offered to accept his authority. Kantakouzenos appointed his relative John Angelos as the province's governor. Although in effect a semi-independent ruler, Angelos was both loyal and effective. He soon brought Epirus, which he had governed in Andronikos II's name in 1340, into the Kantakouzenos' Kantakouzenos camp, and even made gains in Thessaly at the expense of the Catalans of Athens. Another effort by Kantakouzenos to break from Serbia into Macedonia failed before Ceres. In the meantime, Kantakouzenos' wife Irene called upon the aid of the Bulgarians to help relieve the blockade of Demotica by the Regency's army. Ivan Alexander dispatched troops, but although they clashed with the Regency's forces, they made no effort in assisting the city, instead pillaging the countryside.